Okay, so welcome everybody to this Pride Month edition of the Manchester Classical Association public lectures, co-hosted with the Manchester Centre for Public History and Heritage here at Manchester Metropolitan University. It's the last talk of this academic year for both of those centres. So it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome Tom Sapsford, who I wanted to invite the minute I saw his book and managed to digest it very quickly because it's a wonderful book. If you've not read it, I'll give it to your students. It's called Performing the Knaidos, Unmanly Men in Ancient Mediterranean Culture with Oxford University Press, published in 2022. A wonderful read. Tom is an assistant professor in classical studies faculty at Boston College, Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences, with his PhD from the University of Southern California. And if you don't know him, he's a researcher of performance, gender and sexuality in ancient Greek and Roman contexts, especially in Latin imperial verse. He's worked on Greek and Roman dance and adaptations of these and literature by contemporary choreographers. And he's done a lot of this work supported by the Centre for Ballet and Arts at New York University and with Oxford's Archive of Performance of Greek and Roman Drama. And he's published quite widely around some of these topics. And today he's going to talk to us about Red Cheek Boyfriends Tenderly Kissed Me, Alan Ginsberg, Catullus and Sappho. So I'll hand straight over to you, Tom.
Hi everyone, can you hear me first off and can you see the slides?
Yep.
All right, excellent. So thank you so much. It's really lovely to be with you all this evening. And especially I would like to thank Dr. April Pudsey for inviting me along and giving me a chance to present this research to you. Just a quick content warning. I will be discussing various sex acts. There will be some full frontal nudity pictured, and there will be a discussion of ancient Greek and Latin meters. So let's get going. One afternoon, early in December 1954, Allen Ginsberg came face to face with a large oil painting which would change his life forever. In it, a naked, blonde-haired youth sits poised on a couch, gazing directly out at the viewer with his piercing blue eyes. His flesh taut and twisted sat atop a pale throw with a bold meander border, onions at his feet. Ginsberg, 28, had arrived in California earlier that year, a young and still unpublished poet, and related frequently that he fell in love at first sight with this image. The painting was by Robert Levine, whom Ginsberg had befriended earlier at a Polk Street hangout Foster's Cafeteria. Love-struck and stood in Levine's apartment, Ginsberg asked who this person was. The painter replied, "Oh, that's Peter. He's here, he's home." At which point into the room walked 21-year-old Peter Orlovsky, a fellow East Coaster in California, having been recently released from military service, now Levine's roommate, model, and occasional lover. And though Orlovsky never identified as gay per se and was principally attracted to women, that winter a relationship burgeoned between him and Ginsberg, which would endure until Ginsberg's death in 1997. To a classicist, this relationship has a particularly mythical quality. Like Ovid's Pygmalion, Ginsberg falls in love with a mimetic image which shortly thereafter turns into human flesh. However, it is with another Roman poet, Catullus, writing in the late Republic, that Ginsberg most identifies with when working through his intense emotions of love. For Ginsberg's meeting with Orlovsky occasions a reworking of Catullus' poem 38, and forms the beat poet's most thorough engagement with classical antiquity. The choice of Catullus as a model at this point in Ginsberg's life is in many ways unsurprising. Writing in Rome during the 1st century BCE, at a time of great social change, Catullus created short poems in both erotic and obscene tones. This is a poet who, like the young Ginsberg, experimented with poetic form, playing with unusual rhythms such as the scadson, sapphic, galliambic, and perhaps even inventing one himself, the 11-syllable hendecasyllable. This is a poet, too, who is consumed by experiencing and documenting love, describing its many ups and downs in his cycles both to his female beloved Lesbia and to his male beloved Juventius. Moreover, Catullus belonged to what is known as the Neoterics, a group of like-minded poets, often labelled avant-garde by scholars, who shared not only a deep artistic affinity, but also, from what glimpses we get of Catullus's poems, had a kind of social and almost erotic brotherhood. For instance, they frequently cross-referenced each other in their works. This context must obviously have resonated with Ginsberg, who similarly had a literary and social circle of both prose and poetry writers, the Beats, who pushed literary form beyond known bounds, stridently lived an unconventional life, initiating what we would now call the American counterculture, who likewise appear in each other's literary productions. So, for example, Ginsberg becomes Carlo Marx in Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road, and Irwin Garden in several others, Big Sur, The Vanity of Doulow's Visions of Cody. And as we shall now see, Kerouac is the addressee of Ginsberg's adaptation of Catullus's poem, Malest cornifici tuo Catullo. I'll give you the Latin poem in a translation familiar to Ginsberg at the time, and then Ginsberg's freely adapted version, what he calls a paraphrase, published in the collection Reality Sandwiches in 1963. So first, here's Jack Lindsay's Catullus 38 from his 1948 edition. I'm sick, and not to be restored, sick cornificius and bored, worse every day, worse every hour. Why don't you write and share your mirth, a comfort well within your power? I'm angry, has my love no worth? Write then, a line though sad, will ease like songs wept by Simonides. Now, here is Ginsberg's adaptation of Catullus's poem 38. Malest cornifici tuo Catullo. I'm happy, Kerouac. Your madman Alan's finally made it, discovered a new young cat, and my imagination of an eternal boy walks on the streets of San Francisco handsome and meets me in cafeterias and loves me. Ah, don't think I'm sickening. You're angry at me for all my lovers? It's hard to eat shit without having visions. When they have eyes for me, it's like heaven. The first line of the original poem has Catullus announced to his friend and fellow poet Quintus Cornificius that he's ill, malest, and the following lines reveal that the poet is suffering some form of love sickness. Ginsberg rewrite announces the opposite affect. He is happy. Alan's in love, and it's being reciprocated, even if that may be quote unquote sickening to Kerouac. The rewrite of Catullus 38 happened when Ginsberg was living in a hotel overlooking Foster's cafeteria, with Orlovsky staying in another hotel directly across the street. At this point in time, Ginsberg was indeed himself sick, having caught a severe cold that required penicillin shots and much rest on a makeshift pallet bed in between bouts of looking out of the window for Orlovsky entering and leaving Foster's cafeteria. However, compounding Ginsberg's physical sickness was a larger malady, his homosexuality. 2 years earlier, the Diagnostic Handbook of the American Psychiatric Association, the DSM, had classified homosexuality in among sexual deviation as being a mental disorder, and Ginsberg had been seeking treatment to help with what at the time was often considered a mental disease. Though Ginsberg had been undertaking psychoanalysis at the recommendation of William S. Burroughs for years, he'd been seeing his current psychiatrist, Dr. Philip Hicks, weekly since November 1954. At this point in time, he was struggling with how to deal with the complex web of erotic relations that both he, Orlovsky, and Levine were currently involved in, including not only each other, but several other men and women. Ginsberg in particular had been closely involved with an aspiring jazz singer, Sheila Williams, and at the same time was besotted by Orlovsky. Ginsberg, when asked by Hicks what he really wanted to do about his love life, replied that at heart he would prefer, quote, to find an apartment, live with Peter, quit working and write poems, unquote. Ginsberg was rather astonished when Hicks simply agreed, saying, so why don't you do that? You're a nice person. There's always people who will like you. Incidentally, although homosexuality in mid-century America was principally understood as some form of sickness, as its inclusion in the DSM until 1973 attests, Ginsberg, along with William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac, had contributed anonymous accounts of their sex lives to Alfred Kinsey, whose Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, published in 1948, did much to shift the needle on public attitudes to the prevalence and thus acceptability of homoerotic relations between men. While the published version of Malleus Cornifici seems freely adapted and often contrary in its sense to Catullus 38, it was the result of a long process of reworking and rewriting, fortunately preserved for us in Ginsberg's journal from this time. In fact, we have a much closer rendition of 6 of the 8 lines of Catullus's poem, given as a self-titled paradigm. I'm sick, old Kerouac. Hallowed Alan is sick in eternity, laboring lonesome, and worse follows by the days and hours. You're angry at me for all my lovers, but I need a little sweet conversation, sad as the tears of Sebastian Sampus. The first thing to note here is how closely Ginsberg matches this version. Although Ginsberg skips lines 4 and 5 of Catullus's original, the remaining sense of the other lines is quite correspondent. Most notably, unlike the later published poem, in line 1, Alan, like Catullus, is sick. Both he and his addressee Kerouac are given epithets, old and hallowed, respectively. The grave accent on hallowed importantly demonstrates that Ginsberg was trying to translate the poem's original meter as well as its sense. All of the lines are 11 syllables long, and so Ginsberg is clearly aiming to approximate the hendecasyllable metrical scheme used by Catullus in his Latin. At the bottom of the slide here, you'll see the scansion of the opening hendecasyllable of Catullus 42. In line 2, laboring lonesome picks up et laboriose, its alliteration echoing that which occurs earlier in the Latin line, malest me. This repetition of an initial consonant expands to a repetition of complete word in line 3, where magis becomes worse. Unusually, Ginsberg completely alters the poem's sense by switching the addressor and addressee around in the 4th line of his translation. Irasco tibi, I'm mad at you, becomes you're angry at me. The final 2 lines wander further from their source text. Though in the Latin the main verb is omitted, scholars tend to supply an imperative addressed to Cornificius here, palum quid lubet allocutionis, becoming something like send whatever consolation you like. Ginsberg's but I need a little sweet conversation once again switches around the addressor-addressee relationship, and it compacts whatever you like to sweet and makes the consolatory advice into a two-way conversation. The last line of Ginsberg's translation closely matches Catullus's with 2 qualifications. First, the comparative adjective used by Catullus, maistius, sadder than the tears, becomes a positive adjective, sad as the tears. Second, although both poems feature a deceased literary figure as their concluding word, Simonides being a 6th century Greek lyric poet, and Sebastian Sampus, a poet and close friend of Kerouac who had tragically died at the age of 21, the lyric poet Simonides, however, is not contemporary with Cornificius and Catullus as Sampus was with Kerouac and Ginsberg. Note, however, the marked sibilance of Ginsberg's last line, sad as the tears of Sebastian Sampus. As Matthew Pfaff has discussed, Ginsberg picks up on many elements from the original Latin of poem 38 in his final published version. In line 1 of Ginsberg, we get sonic echoes of its predecessor, the alliteration of Cornifici, Kerouac, and the assonance of tuo Catullo, madman Alan. In line 3, magis becomes imagination, and through the similar syllabic distribution and sound values, dies et horas becomes of an eternal. Line 7 of Ginsberg closely renders sic meos amores as for all my lovers. Ginsberg's journal and its various iterations of the translation afford us a useful bridge between the Catullus source text and Ginsberg's published paraphrase. For instance, Ginsberg's original "sick in eternity" gets redistributed. Sick gets delayed to line 6, don't you think I'm sickening, and eternity moved to line 3, where now it becomes an epithet for Peter Orlovsky, an eternal boy. Interestingly, all the individuals in this homosocial triangle now have them: Old Kerouac, Madman Alan, Eternal Orlovsky. Most importantly, this paradigm shows that Ginsberg was happy to make the sense of certain phrases almost opposite to their original meaning. So, you're angry at me for irascible to be in the first paradigm foreshadows in a way the big shift of Catullus's opening declaration, malest, I'm sick, to Ginsberg's appositional, I'm happy, in his published version. Other entries from Ginsberg's journal of this time contribute insights on the second half of the poem. Adjacent entries, not dated but either on or just before January the 5th, 1955, provide a variant for line 8. It's hard to live on earth without having visions, instead of it's hard to eat shit without having visions. And another entry states, quote, Peter, I feel as if I'm in heaven, unquote, reflecting the poem's final line. When they have eyes for me, it's like heaven. This closing couplet, absent from Catullus, again engenders a reversal. Alan needs no sad consolations from his friend Jack, or even his friend's friend Sebastian Sampus, or sad old Simonides for that matter. He has Peter and the poetic visions that this eternal boy inspires. Here we return to the mythic moment when Ginsberg was transported beyond the earthly realm, and so upon seeing Levine's painting of Orlovsky naked and gazing directly into the poet's eyes, Ginsberg realized, it's hard to eat shit without having visions. When they have eyes for me, it's like heaven. With its mention of Jack Kerouac and Sebastian Sampus, the marriage of classical literature and Ginsberg's close artistic and social circle, later to be called the Beat Generation, is certainly present in his reworking of Catullus 38. However, we can track the connection between the poet's literary study and his subversive friend group back to Ginsberg's freshman year at Columbia University. Here, on the one hand, Ginsberg meets a cast of characters who are to shape his intellectual life, not only Kerouac, but Lucien Carr, William S. Burroughs, Joan Volmer, and Edie Parker. This crew was augmented by Neal Cassady in 1946, who would, until Orlovsky, become the object of Ginsberg's erotic desires, which were fulfilled sexually, but much to Ginsberg's distress, not reciprocated romantically. Yet this first year at Columbia also saw Ginsberg's first sustained engagement with the classics through Columbia's Colloquium on Important Books seminar, with readings in classical epic, drama, history, oratory, and philosophy. This seminar was led by the prominent literary critic Lionel Trilling, who took Ginsberg under his wing and was transformative enough for Ginsberg to shift his academic focus from law to literature. In the early summer of 1954 in San Francisco, Ginsberg had been reading classical literature and experimenting with its poetic forms, in particular through his reworkings of Catullus's poems. Ginsberg's journal from this time contained a Uwentius poem to Cassady, Uwentius, as mentioned earlier, being Catullus's often named male beloved. It also includes an invective more loosely along the lines of a Catullan model, and then a fairly close translation of Catullus poem 5, the first lines of which in Ginsberg's version go, let's live, my Lesbia, let's love and value. In August of 54, Ginsberg read a swathe of classical poetry, noting down the following in a reading list: Sophocles' Philoctetes, Tibullus, Marlowe's translations of Ovid's elegies, and multiple translations of Catullus, William Aitken, Horace Gregory, Jack Lindsay, and the Loeb edition by F.W. Cornish. Yet when Ginsberg creates his two large and most lauded poems, Howl in 1956 and Kaddish in 1961, the interest in the classical so clearly shown that first year in San Francisco seems to vanish. Moreover, In 1964, Ginsberg took part in the journal Arion's questionnaire issue, which quizzed 34 modern writers on their relationship to classical literature. And while, as we saw, that during the San Francisco Poetry Renaissance and earlier, Ginsberg had been deeply invested in Greek and Roman poets, by the mid-60s, his view was much more ambivalent. He writes, "The classics and the man of letters, a basic semantic mistake, a misnomer. 3/4 the world's ancient literature is left out. Where's the Mahabharata, the ocean of story, the Puranas, etc.? Who's classics? The man of letters is also generally a finky old bore." In light of Ginsberg's extended trip in 1962 and 3 to India with Orlovsky and then Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Japan on his own, there was a dramatic shift in the poet's perspective. Ginsberg formed a deep connection with Eastern religions and philosophies. This look eastwards is firmly expressed in the Arion contribution, where, much like many of us are doing today, Ginsberg questions the restrictively tight geographical and cultural remit applied to the term classics. He continues, "In conclusion, at the present time, I find the Oriental classics have more to say to me and more connection with the actual phenomenon of my mystical social significance than the Western classics." Matthew Pfaff has termed this shift in Ginsberg's poetic and cultural allegiances as his classical silence, writing, "After Howell, Ginsberg distanced his poetics from Greek and Roman texts as sites of poetic or linguistic authority, instead resituating its intertextual geography by prioritizing first a biblical, then an Oriental past, embracing Kerouac's Eastern future. For a period of over a decade, Greek and Latin texts appeared only as members of egalitarian lists or as ambient allusions in Ginsberg's verse, and even then in small numbers or as figures for hegemony itself." Somewhat paradoxically, Ginsberg's eastward turn eventually leads to the poet breaking this classical silence with a piece written in Sapphics while teaching his basic poetics course at the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at the Naropa Institute, a Buddhist liberal arts university founded in 1974 in Boulder, Colorado by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Ginsberg had met Trungpa by chance on the streets of Manhattan and had first heard him lecture in San Francisco in the summer of 1971. Chogyam Trungpa had as an infant been determined to be a major tulku, or reincarnated teacher of the Kagyu tradition of Buddhism. Since fleeing the Red Army in Tibet in 1959, Trungpa had lived in India, the UK, and was now in the United States. Seen as instrumental in popularizing Tibetan Buddhism in the United States, Trungpa was a controversial figure. He smoked, drank, had sex with several of his women followers, and would deliberately provoke to initiate some form of teachable moment. This combination of Buddhism and freewheeling behavior aligned perfectly with Ginsberg's own worldview. Trungpa would from this point on be Ginsberg's personal guru. Trungpa's school, the Naropa Institute, was named after Naropa, the 11th century abbot of the ancient University of Nalanda in India. This modern university, like its ancient precedent, aimed to combine scholarly wisdom and meditative insight. Naropa began as a summer institute in 1974, the first iteration being held in an old bus depot in Boulder, Colorado. It ran a year-round program from 1987 and received national accreditation from 1983, formally renamed Naropa University in 1999. At the inaugural Summer Institute, 1,500 students attended, many more than had initially been expected. At Trungpa's invitation, Ginsberg, along with fellow poet Anne Waldman, with the involvement of John Cage and Deanda Prima, set up a poetry school named after Ginsberg's now dead friend and the addressee of Malice Quanifici, the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, disembodied as Kerouac was not around to guide the school, continues to this day, offering undergraduate programs and an MFA. It also runs a summer writing program which embodies, so the website states, the legacy of revolutionary scholarship and counter-poetics that exists alongside, but in healthy resistance to the norms of academic mainstream culture. In May 1980, 6 years into the Institute, as part of his basic poetics course, Ginsberg gave a lecture at Naropa on Sapphic meters, the aeolic verse form used by the lesbian poet Sappho. In addition to discussing several ancient examples by Sappho, Catullus, and Horace, and modern English renditions of the meter, Sidney, Campion, Tennyson, Swinburne, and Auden, Ginsberg reveals that he has been experimenting with the form himself and encourages the assembled students to do the same. I suggest you try writing them, but try writing them in strict meters. I stayed up last night all night, just beginning about midnight and continued till about 2 in the afternoon, working on my Sapphics. So I've got now something like 10 stanzas, which I'll read Saturday night. They got dirtier and dirtier. And then finally I wound up at dawn and remembered she had garlands of celery. So I wound up at dawn with the Sapphic growing, nourished that night with the rain and the radishes in the garden. I started mentioning all the local flowers in the garden as she did, sort of as a way of getting out of the sex obsession. I've put the full metrical scheme of the Sapphic stanza here on the slide. However, a simplified way of thinking about it is 3 lines each formed of 11 syllables, though in a different rhythmic pattern to our earlier hendecasyllables. These 3 11-syllable lines are then followed by an adoneus or adonic, the term Ginsberg preferred, a shorter end rhythm to the stanza, which recognizably goes boom, diddy, boom, boom. The complete poem, published in the collection Plutonium Ode in 1982, is actually 12 and not 10 stanzas long. It's titled Tethnarchen doligo pedues phainamai and takes as its title, I Appear Almost to be Dead, from lines 15 and 16 of Sappho Fragment 31. Sappho 31 is a poem that has famously been reworked, most notably by Catullus in his poem 51. And Ginsberg has his students read several versions of this in his basic poetics lecture, where he calls it the poem to the young girl. Its well-known premise is that Sappho laments that another man, not she, sits opposite her beloved, and then goes on to describe the physical pain of this experience. As with my first example, I'll give the Sappho in a translation familiar to and beloved by Ginsberg, that by his mentor, William Carlos Williams, and then we'll look at how Ginsberg reworks the Sappho. That man is peer of the gods, who face to face sits listening to your sweet speech and lovely laughter. It is this that rouses a tumult in my breast. At mere sight of you, my voice falters, my tongue is broken. Straightway a delicate fire runs in my limbs. My eyes are blinded and my ears thunder. Sweat pours out, a trembling hunts me down. I grow paler than grass and lack little of dying. Ginsberg begins his poem gently, but the tone rapidly heats up. Note how the word tender links the various movements throughout the poem. Red-cheeked boyfriends tenderly kiss me, sweet-mouthed, under boulder coverlets. Winter, springtime, hug me naked, laughing and telling girlfriends, gossip till autumn. Aging love escapes with his childish body. Monday, one man visited, sleeping, big-cocked. Older moustache, crooked mouth, not the same teenager I sucked off. This kid comes on Thursdays with happy hard-ons. Long nights talking, heart to heart, reading verses, fucking hours, he comes in me happy, but I can't get it in him. A catalogue of sexual conquests and catastrophes follows, which is then capped off with a more reflective stanza. Future youth, I never may touch any more. Hark these Sapphics, lipped in my hollow spirit, everlasting tenderness breathed in these vowels, sighing for love still. Now, Ginsberg turns his attention to his moonlit garden. Song your cadence formed while a May night's full moon, yellow onions, tulips in fresh rain, pale grass, iris pea pods, radishes grew at this verse, blossomed in dawnlight. The moonlight garden stanza in which Ginsberg says that he recalls Sappho's garlands of celery actually provides a clearer point of juncture to Sappho fragment 31. Thus, pale grass, iris, pea pods grew at this verse contains within it two green items, which echo Sappho's comparison of herself as paler or greener than grass. And from this point on, the Sappho fragment becomes more and more apparent in Ginsberg's poem. The green of grass returns as the green eyes of a beautiful boy who will remain the topic of the poem's last three stanzas. Moreover, this vegetal and vernal contemplation cedes to an intimacy we might conceive as evergreen. Measure forever, his face 18 years old, green eyes, blonde hair, muscular, gold, soft skin, whose godlike boy's voice mocked me once 3 decades past. Come here and screw me. Ginsberg then connects closely to the eponymous Sappho fragment before a closing stanza. Breast struck, scared to look in his eyes, blood pulsing my ears, mouth dry. Tongue never moved, ribs shook a trembling fire, ran down my heart to my thighs, lovesick to this day. Heavy-limbed, I sat in a chair and watched him, sleep naked all night, afraid to kiss his mouth, tender, dying, waited for sunrise ago in Manhattan. Here now is Ginsberg's 11th stanza alongside the Sappho original, this time with Anne Carson's translation. Ginsberg compacts the majority of Sappho's symptoms from 3 stanzas into a single one. However, the sites of agony are closely matched: cardian breast, opataceae eyes, glossa tongue. Moreover, Sappho's fluttering or winged chest becomes ribs shook a trembling. The drumming ears become blood pulsing my ears. Ginsberg's tongue never moved conflates no speaking is left in me, tongue breaks in the source text, and Sappho's shooting pains change from thin fire racing under skin to fire ran down my heart to my thighs. Furthermore, if Ginsberg has been rendering Sappho's Greek meter into an English equivalent in this pained stanza, he attempts to echo a further rhythmical feature of fragment 31, namely its unusual placement of caesurae or word ends. Ginsberg affects this choppiness within the line by inserting extra spaces between word clusters, and so creates the 4 following rhythmically isolated or broken off phrases, followed by a long run-on line of 19 syllables, before resolving in what we'll see is a semantically loaded Adonic of lovesick to this day. So we get breast struck, space, space, scared to look in his eyes, space, space, blood pulsing my ears, space, space, mouth dry, space, space, tongue never moved, rib shook a trembling, fire ran down my heart to my thighs, lovesick to this day. The mention of lovesick to this day summons up our earlier Catullus poem and its opening words, malest, and completes a poetic triangulation, Sappho, Catullus, Ginsberg, who all now have written a poem about a godlike man in their various renditions of the poem to the young girl, to borrow Ginsberg's somewhat odd title of this poem. In Sappho's original version, fragment 31, she suffers the pain of watching a man equal to the gods, Isos theoisin, sat across from her beloved. In Catullus's Latin translation of Sappho, poem 51, the beloved is now mentioned by name a little later on in the poem, Lesbia, itself a pseudonym summoning up Sappho as much as whichever real-life figure lies behind Catullus's famous mistress. The man in Catullus, however, is now not just equal, but is declared to surpass the gods, ille videtur superare divos. Ginsberg, perhaps unsurprisingly, takes more liberties with his own translation. In his version, the third person, Sappho's Canos or Catullus's ille, is at first glance absent. Instead, it is the beloved who receives a comparison to the divine, whose godlike boy's voice. Moreover, the seated figure who in both Sappho and Catullus is the poet's rival for their beloved now becomes Catullus himself. heavy-limbed. I sat in a chair and watched him sleep naked all night, afraid to kiss his mouth, tender dying, waited for sunrise ago in Manhattan. Lastly, while Sappho and Catullus are describing an event in present time, Ginsberg is ruminating on his own history, mocked me once 3 decades past. Here it seems as if it is time itself and not merely another man who has driven a wedge between Ginsberg and a young beauty from his past. The invidiousness of time is restated in the final stanza, where the marked enjambment, ago, draws both our eye and our ear to the unbridgeable gap between an aging poet and the eternal 18-year-old he once sat vigil for. This poem, although at first starting out as just a rhythmical writing exercise, becomes midway through a deeper engagement for Ginsberg with poetic forebears, both modern, his mentor William Carlos Williams, and ancient, Sappho and Catullus. And whereas Catullus's Roman poetic circle, the Neoterics with its suave urbanity and social networks, creates a landscape analogous for Ginsberg to San Francisco in the 50s, with its all-night cafeterias and attitude of free love, Boulder, Colorado creates a very different erotic and intellectual community, one that is rural, remote, but deeply invested in poetry, beauty, education, and love. Information on Sappho's actual living circumstances is hard to piece together, except through her own verses, which themselves suggest a landscape of flowery groves peopled with girls or women that are often noted for having left or graduated from Sappho's circle. Ginsberg clearly views Sappho's Lesbos similarly, for he describes it in his poetic lecture as a kind of quote-unquote Venusian Vassar. Vassar, of course, being an extremely elite all-female liberal arts college in upstate New York. Notably, both Lesbos and Boulder are locations from which our poets will experience both beauty and its loss. The beauty of youth developing, like the blooming growth of Ginsberg's pea pods or Sappho's anise, mellotot, and celery, and the inevitable loss of the beloved as they move on from these educative communities. Both Males cornifici tuo Catullo and Tithnarchen doligo pedues phanomai share several similar elements. On the one hand, while both are recognizably riffing on their Sapphic and Catullan originals, each takes massive license with its source text. On the other hand, these two poems both directly cite the original Greek and Latin in their titles. Thus, they straddle a simultaneous proximity to and distance away from their classical sources. The distance between source text and adaptation allows Ginsberg not only to translate the sentiments of the poems in a loose but apt way for his present-day circumstances, be that making art and fucking friends in San Francisco, or the more wistful mentoring that happens in Boulder, Colorado, but the classical also significantly allows Ginsberg a way of framing his desires through the figure of an eternal boy. In Malest, this boy is a new young cat, Ginsberg's imagination of an eternal boy, handsome, and when he has eyes for Alan, it's like heaven. In Tithnarchen, the boy commemorated in the poem's final stanzas should be contemplated forever. His face, 18 years old, green eyes, blonde hair, muscular, gold, soft skin. A muse with power to shine beyond the poet's now aging gaze. With many of the characteristics of this unnamed boy being so similar to how Levine portrayed Peter Orlovsky in Nude with Onions, muscular, blonde, gold skin, it would be easy simply to identify Orlovsky here as Ginsberg's referent. However, I'm not convinced it's so simple. For Ginsberg also reveals in his basic poetics lecture that while composing his late-night Sapphics, he suddenly realized that he had intuitively and inadvertently already used this verse meter once before in a poem published in 1968 called On Neil's Ashes. Delicate eyes that blink blue Rockies all ash. Nipples, ribs I touch with my thumb are ash mouth. My tongue touched once or twice all ash bony cheeks, soft on my belly. Are cinder, ash, earlobes and eyelids youthful, cock tip, curly, pubis, breast warm, high school thigh, asshole annealed to silken skin, all ashes again. Moreover, it is Neil Cassidy, the first big love of Ginsberg's life, and not Peter Orlovsky, who is the figure most often noted for his striking green eyes. And perhaps not unrelatedly, green becomes a motif in several early poems in which Ginsberg ruminates on his relationship with Cassidy. It is also associated in Ginsberg's mind as a cipher for homosexuality itself, both with the green carnation worn by Oscar Wilde in his gay circle and with a particular shade of green galbanatus worn by gay prostitutes in ancient Rome. The association of green with Ginsberg's erotic desire for Cassidy happens most notably in the poem Green Automobile from 1953, when Ginsberg describes making a lover's vow with Cassidy on a road trip from Denver to Texas in 1947. The windshield's full of tears, rain wets our naked breasts, we kneel together in the shade amid the traffic of night in paradise. And now renew the solitary vow we made each other take in Texas once. I can't inscribe here. My best guess is that the imagined world of classical antiquity allows Ginsberg to do his own form of myth-making by blending aspects of the two handsome youths with whom he was most besotted into the figure of the eternal ephebe or beautiful boy. So much for distance. Now for Ginsberg's desire to remain near to his models and the importance of keeping the original Latin and Greek in these poems' titles. First and most obviously, the citations explicitly signal the respective source text to the reader. This is particularly useful since the connections between Ginsberg's paraphrases and the originals could otherwise easily be missed. However, I think this form of citation has another and more important function, meter. By providing a line in hendecasyllables as the title for Malest and a partial suffix for Tethnarchen, Ginsberg actually embeds the original quantitative meter of his source poems, one which he will translate closely in his qualitative suffix and more loosely in his published Malest, but which he originally wrote in strict 11-syllable lines, as we saw with I'm sick, old Kerouac, hallowed Alan. This interest in classical rhythms is therefore as important an aspect of antiquity to Ginsberg as the freedom with which he sees homoerotic passion being expressed in both the poetry of Sappho and Catullus. Moreover, this fascination with intricate and ancient rhythms gets us perhaps to appreciate the depth of Ginsberg's engagement with his poetic forebears, as well as allowing us to reconsider what the beat in Beat Generation can be widened to encompass. A famously contested term, both in regards to whom it actually included and from where the moniker came, most often beat is understood as referring to a generation who opted out of normative society as deadbeats. Ginsberg himself leaned into the more spiritually loaded sense the term could give, with its closeness in sound to the word beatus, the Latin for blessed, i.e. beatific or beatitudes. But the two poems we've encountered this evening do something different and widen beat's semantic range further. For beat also refers to rhythm, be that the free-flowing verse and long sentences of Ginsberg's famous poems Howl and Kaddish, or be that the hendecasyllables and suffix that Ginsberg so closely and lovingly engages with in these two poems, separated by almost 3 decades in the poet's career. Thank you.